chairs to pick.
Good morning and welcome to Face Off, Recognizing and Challenging the Use of Facial Recognition Technology, a webinar by NACDL. I'm Jumana Musa. I'm the director of NACDL's Fourth Amendment Center, which exists to educate and provide resources to attorneys on digital Fourth Amendment issues like facial recognition and also provide technical assistance and litigation support. Police departments across the country have been using facial recognition technology, often in ways that are not known to the defense, in the way that they investigate and identify suspects. Body camera manufacturers are starting to incorporate facial recognition technology into their cameras themselves. And recently we found even private companies like Amazon are developing facial recognition technology and offering it to law enforcement agencies without a lot being known about its reliability, how it's being used, and how it's showing up. So NACDL pulled together a series of experts to talk about how the technology works, who's using it, and how, and what to do if it shows up in your cases. Today we're going to be hearing from Clare Garvie, who is the Senior Associate at the Georgetown Law Center on Privacy and Technology. She's also the lead researcher on the Perpetual Lineup, Unregulated Police Facial Recognition in America, a report that really did a comprehensive look on the use of facial recognition in law enforcement agencies across the country. We will then hear from Dr. Joshua Kroll. He is a computer scientist at the School of Information at UC Berkeley, studying the relationship between governance, public policy, and computer systems to get into the science of how all of this works. And we'll then hear from Kaitlin Jackson, who is an attorney with the Bronx Defenders, and she's currently challenging identifications based on facial recognition technology. This program is supported by grant number 2013 MUBX-K014, awarded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance. The Bureau of Justice Assistance is a component of the Office of Justice Programs, which also includes the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the National Institute of Justice, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, the Office of Victims of Crime, and the Office of Sex Offender Sentencing, Monitoring, Apprehending, and Registering. We will have time for questions at the end of the webinar. If you have a question, you can email them to me at jmusa@nacdl.org. That will also be up on the screen. And please sit tight and let's hear about facial recognition technology.
Thanks, Jumana. I'm going to start off by telling you a little bit about giving a general overview of what facial recognition technology is and how law enforcement agencies are using it. So what is facial recognition? What are we talking about when we talk about this technology? Very, very simply, it is the automated process of comparing two images of faces to determine whether they represent the same individual. Now, face recognition refers to a lot of other things. It refers to face detection. It refers to face verification. Is this person who they say they are? What we're probably going to be focusing on most today is face recognition. Who is this person? And the way law enforcement agencies determine who a person is in a photo using face recognition is to take the probe photo, the photo of the unknown individual. That's the gentleman wearing a baseball cap in the image, against a database of known individuals. Law enforcement agencies take probe photos, the photos of the unknown individuals, from name a source of a face photograph, from social media, from CCTV camera footage, from composite sketches, unfortunately, from cell phone video, from hard drives that have been dumped. Basically, wherever a face photograph might show up, that can be used as a probe photo. What are the database photos? Most traditionally, law enforcement use mugshot databases. These are databases that they already have that are lists of faces associated with known identities already. Increasingly, however, law enforcement have access to DMV databases in their respective jurisdictions. We know at least in 31 states, law enforcement agencies can either directly search or request a search of the DMV database of their state. About 44 states have face recognition systems that run in their DMVs already for fraud detection and deduplication purposes. And we think about 31 states allow those searches for criminal justice purposes as well. So how do police use face recognition? As it stands today, face recognition is an investigative lead. This is a screenshot of the Chief of Detectives memo in the NYPD, which very, very clearly states that, and this is the information that's associated with a possible match of produced by a face recognition system that gets sent back to the investigating officer, very clearly says it does not produce a positive identification, and instead the investigating officer needs to corroborate that identification by doing further investigation into the identity. However, what further corroboration is needed is far from clear and varies jurisdiction by jurisdiction. It probably varies officer by officer. Here's a clip from a case where face recognition was used, again in New York, so the same jurisdiction where that policy exists, and an iCard was issued for an individual solely on the basis of a face recognition match. That person was apprehended and put in a lineup solely on the basis of that face recognition match. So is that sufficient corroboration, or should that individual not have been apprehended based on a possible match only? That just goes to show that we call it an investigative lead, but what that means in terms of its impacts on a client, on an individual, is far from clear. In addition, I cannot overemphasize this. As it stands now, law enforcement agencies agree that it's an investigative lead. However, the FBI has stated publicly that in the next 2 to 3 years, they expect that they will get face recognition technology to the point where it can be a positive ID. This means a positive ID without the need for an individual to corroborate the identification in any way, including an analyst taking a look at the two photos to determine whether they represent the same individual. They do acknowledge that they will probably have to go through a Fry or a Daubert hearing to verify this information. So what they're doing as we speak is mobilizing their experts and drafting papers to be able to make this case in front of a judge that face recognition has become a positive ID. For reference, right now the only biometric that does not receive any human review that's considered a lights-out positive ID by itself is a 10-print match. It's a match of all 10 fingerprints. Single fingerprints and DNA still get a review by an expert, a DNA expert or a fingerprint expert. So what does it look like on the ground? Very, very broadly, we group the use of face recognition by law enforcement into 4 categories. The first is what we can call stop and identify. These are jurisdictions where they have face recognition on their mobile devices, and officers in the field, after they stop somebody, let's say they stop somebody for a traffic stop, and that individual fails to produce identification, or the officer believes that that identification is fraudulent, they can snap a photo of that individual, run that through face recognition, and receive a match or a possible match on their phone in seconds. That's in a handful of jurisdictions, including Michigan, Florida, San Diego, Pennsylvania, and a handful of other jurisdictions as well. The most common use of face recognition and associated with most jurisdictions is arrest and identify. Upon arrest, when a booking photo is taken, that photo will be searched against the existing database as well as enrolled into the mugshot database to be used for future searches. Investigate and identify refers to how I defined the use of face recognition at the beginning, taking a photo of an unknown individual and comparing it against a list of known identities. Investigate and identify has a few features that I want to make explicit before moving on to the final form of face recognition, and that is it's usually a photo of a single individual at a past event. So we have an identification or a non-identification, a John Doe tied to a past event that law enforcement are seeking to identify. I clarify this because the last form of face recognition that you'll hear about a lot in the news today is what we can call face surveillance. Face recognition technology is unique. If we think of it as a biometric, it's unique in that it can be captured remotely and on groups of people at any given time, which makes it capable of being used as a surveillance tool. This would be real-time cameras, live feed cameras, scanning every single face that it can capture on essentially walking by the camera, and comparing those photos against whatever database law enforcement is seeking to identify. Commonly, these would be watch lists, let's say people with outstanding warrants. 2 years ago, companies would say it has to be a limited database. You can only look for a set number of people. Today, the companies making and selling this technology say they can run real-time face recognition off of dozens of cameras against databases of upwards of 1 billion people. So this enables law enforcement or whatever other user of face recognition technology to be able to essentially search everybody walking by a camera against however big the database they have at hand. In China, this is the Chinese government is attempting to enroll all citizens. So that's the scale at which the technology can be used. What departments use face recognition? It might surprise you that it's pretty common. This is a map of actually just the areas where law enforcement have access to driver's license photos. The states in dark blue are where both state and local and FBI agents have access to search driver's license photos. The light blue is where it's at the state and local level still. The grayed out states does not mean they are exempt from law enforcement face recognition technology. California, Massachusetts, New York, and elsewhere, they also have face recognition systems that run against mugshot databases. We estimate conservatively that at least 25% of all law enforcement agencies across the country have access to a face recognition system. I would not be at all surprised if that number is a lot higher. Another perspective on this is that over 50% of all U.S. adults are now enrolled in a face recognition database that's accessible for criminal searches, thanks to getting a driver's license.
Well, thank you, Claire. I'm Joshua Kroll. As Jimena said, I'm here as an unfrozen caveman computer scientist to tell you about how this technology works and how we might evaluate it in the context of looking at how to prosecute cases. Before we begin, though, I want to set out a couple of terms. I'm an academic, so I like to define terms. You often hear the term artificial intelligence, and face recognition is a type of artificial intelligence. So what is artificial intelligence? I would say, thinking broadly, that artificial intelligence is any behavior by a machine which, if it were done by a human, we would think of it as being intelligent. So recognizing a face, recognizing a face as belonging to an identifiable person, certainly an intelligent behavior. One kind of technology that's used to build artificially intelligent systems, not the only kind of technology, but increasingly the technology that people mean when they say artificial intelligence, is a technology called machine learning. And machine learning is a technology which sort of amazingly finds totally automatically patterns in data that you feed into it. So what that means is you start in this diagram over on the left with a set of labeled observations. So these might be, for example, pictures where you've annotated where in the picture is there a face and whose face is it, and maybe some other details. And then typically you break that set of labeled observations into two sets that we call a training set and a test or an evaluation set. We use the training set to build the machine learning system. So we hand the training set off to a machine learning algorithm. That algorithm outputs some kind of predictive model. And that model can then be evaluated on the test set. And we don't evaluate on the training set because we want to make sure that we've actually captured the patterns and we haven't just learned to repeat the patterns in the data that we saw. We haven't just memorized the data that we've given to the system. We've actually learned something that allows us to see patterns and generalize and apply those patterns in new contexts, and then we can evaluate the performance of the model, the accuracy, certain, what kinds of errors it has. And so that's the technology that goes into a lot of building face recognition systems. So this is a simplified face recognition system. Face recognition does not work just by taking photos and matching them in one step to identities. There are multiple steps in the pipeline, typically, and the reason for that is that going straight from a photo to an identity is a little bit too hard a problem for today's machine learning technologies, and probably too hard a problem even as the technology gets better. And so it makes sense to break it into these smaller, simpler problems. The first of which is face identification, basically asking, is there a face in this image or not? And then once we have identified where the faces are in the image, we might do some kind of alignment step where we crop the image to just be a picture of a face and maybe scale it to the size we want to analyze later in the pipeline. In some cases, alignment might be a little bit more intensive. If someone is looking slightly to the side, maybe we will deform the photo a little bit so that it appears that they are, in the edited photo, looking straight on at the camera. And the reason is that it's easier to identify faces when they're looking straight on at the camera. Maybe we'll edit the contrast or try to fix the illumination a little bit in automated ways. Once we have that standardized, normalized photo that's good for processing, it gets passed off to an analysis step, which you will often hear referred to as feature extraction or feature processing, or sometimes feature engineering in the context of building these systems. And that's a question of how do you take the face and describe it in a way that a machine can understand. Sometimes people use the word face print to refer to this by analogy to fingerprint. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Once you have a description of the face, then you can match it to the database of people who've been enrolled into the system. Sometimes this database is referred to as the background set by people who work in this area. And I should mention that each of these problems is independently a difficult machine learning problem, and it can fail. And obviously, the earlier in the pipeline you fail, the more likely you are to fail at the overall problem of assigning an identity to an image of a face. So, for example, if you fail to detect a face in the first stage, then you're obviously going to fail. But also, in an alignment step, if you decide that some face has an eye in the place where a human would say, oh, that's actually an ear, then you're going to just massively deform the face in processing, and you're going to completely fail catastrophically in the recognition task that you're seeking. So when humans look at images, we are very good at extracting patterns. And it shouldn't surprise you that these face recognition systems work in a pipeline. Our visual system also works in a pipeline. So in our peripheral vision, we're pretty good at detecting whether an object is there, not so good at identifying fine details of the object. It has to be sort of closer into the center of our gaze. We have to focus on it. To identify people in a crowd or in a photo with multiple people, we actually have to attend our gaze to each face individually before we can identify it. And so while we might look at pictures and see faces on Mars or faces in cars or faces on the sandwich we had for breakfast, things work differently for a computer. A computer just sees pixels in an image, and the pixels do not have any inherent meaning. They're just intensity typically, and typically these systems run on photos that have been converted to black and white because the color information tends to just make the problem noisier and harder and more difficult to solve. And so when you're looking at these pixels, how do you break down the how do you actually solve each of these individual problems? And there are different techniques that are used at each stage. So here's an example of what face identification looks like. So the problem here is to find all the faces in the images and to put little boxes around them, and then we could cut the insides of those boxes out and scale them to a standard size for further analysis. You'll see that in the photo on the left, one face has been missed by the algorithm, and that's a face that is sort of looking a little bit away from the camera, and that highlights an important feature of these systems, which is that they work better for faces that face onto the camera straight and are well illuminated. So things like pose or illumination, even facial expression, can really change the effectiveness of these systems. And cutting edge, the most robust systems are robust to changes in pose, illumination, and expression, and other variation that we see in photography. Once we have an identified face and we have a close crop view of that face, we're going to align it. So in the upper photo you see an example of how that alignment typically works. You use a machine learning algorithm to identify landmark points on the face that are key points in facial geometry that belong to an idealized face. And so on the right you see an idealized face model, face geometry model. And once we found those landmarks, we perturb the image so that the landmark points we found map into the place that we believe they should go in the idealized face. And so in the lower photo you see an example of that. The face on the left is slightly askew, slightly not facing the camera, but then once it has been adjusted to a standardized face, it is more directly facing the camera, and the left side of it has sort of been deformed so that it appears to be level and face straight onto the camera. Once you have an aligned, standardized, normalized picture to look at, you need to describe it somehow. So if we asked humans to solve this problem, they would tell us things about facial features that we're all familiar with: eyes, noses, ears, mouths, and you might say this person has a certain kind of facial hair, or their eyes are large, or their eyes are small, or their eyes are set close, or their eyes are set far apart, or their forehead is a certain size, or their earlobes are attached or not. These are all things that humans might use to annotate a photo. For a computer, the approach is very different. So you're trying to build, like I said, a face print, which is just a numerical description of the face. And in the most cutting-edge systems, these features that get extracted start from an analysis of the whole image. So in older face recognition systems, there were similar kind of localized features, kind of like the landmark points where we might say, you know, the corner of the eye is particularly discriminative. And that's a key point here. These features that the machine is going to extract are not features that maybe seem understandable to us as humans, but they are features that distinguish the faces sort of maximally from each other, kind of separate the faces from each other in such a way that it's easiest for the machine to say these faces belong to this person and these other faces belong to this other identity. Most commonly, state-of-the-art face recognition systems today end up digesting everything into a set of about 128 numbers that correspond to a face print in a space where the distance between these sets of numbers corresponds to the similarity in faces. And so sets of numbers that are close together represent faces that are similar, and sets of numbers that are very different from each other represent faces that are also very different from each other. And I've shown here on this slide as well in the upper right a neural network, which is the technology that is often used today to extract these face prints and to find these encodings from an image into some latent encoding space. So just another picture of how that might look. If we imagine that images are the colored dots on the left, and those are faces, and they're kind of all jumbled together, and we're not sure how to make sense of them or how to separate the person with the red examples from the person with the blue examples. We want to learn some way of re-representing those examples as a set of numbers that allow us to cleanly find a separation between those and cleanly match up identities to parts of that feature space. Once we have the features and that face print, we're going to go back to our database of enrolled users, our background set, and we're going to compare against the face prints that we have already. We might use a machine learning algorithm to do this, to say what's the most likely identity for a given face print. We might instead just look for the closest face print to the one that we have numerically. Many ways you can measure that distance mathematically, and that turns the face print into an identity by saying here is the most likely identity, or here is the closest face print that we were aware of, and that's going to turn the face print into a name, Jane Doe. There are many ingredients in the technology here. I'm going to talk specifically about evaluation along two dimensions. One is training data, so you'll recall from the first slide about machine learning that we build the system based on a set of labeled examples. And the thing about those sets of labeled examples is that they have to represent the data that you are actually using the system with. And if they don't, then there's an opportunity for bias where the system might work better on some people who are more like the examples given in the training data than others who are maybe not represented in the training data. And then the other is there are many choices that get made along the line, many thresholds and parameters that get set, and oftentimes those thresholds have a big impact on the accuracy of the overall system and a big impact on how it's used. And so I want to talk about that a little bit. So if we go back to the face recognition pipeline, the simplified face recognition pipeline that I described earlier, we see that only the last stage, the identification stage, the matching of faces, relies on the enrolled users. The other stages are created using a different training set. And in fact, each of those phases can be created using a training set which is different from the training set used in the other phases, meaning that the phases may not actually be directly comparable to each other in a mathematically meaningful way. And what that means in particular is that the training sets that are used to create earlier stages of the pipeline may not represent that background set, the set of people who've been enrolled into the face recognition system. And so, as I said, there's a chance there for bias. And what does that look like in practice? Well, if we just focus on the first stage, which is, as far as I can tell, the only stage at which there's been good scientific research on this question, we see this is a photograph of a woman by the name of Joy Buolamwini. She is a computer scientist. She did her PhD on face recognition at MIT, and when she started to study face recognition, she had a problem, which is that her face recognition system did not detect her own face. And she discovered, she just tried to debug it and say, why doesn't this detect my face? And she discovered that if she put a white mask on, it would detect her face. And she thought, well, that's a little bit strange. And so she did a study which she called Gender Shades. And so these are the results of the study. And what you see is if you look at kind of three top commercial face recognition technologies from Microsoft, IBM, and Face++, which is a company in China that is thought to have probably the largest database, background labeled database of faces on which to train face recognition systems. You see performance such that when you show 10 randomly selected faces to these products, about 9 times out of 10 they will detect that there is a face in the image. If on the upper right you break down the faces you show the products by gender, you find that there is maybe only about an 80% chance that they identify women compared to that same kind of high 90% chance that they identify a man. And so they work a lot less well for women than for men. In the lower left, you see if you break out the faces by skin tone, there is a similar fall-off in accuracy for darker-skinned subjects as compared to lighter-skinned subjects. And finally, in the lower right, if you break by both of these dimensions simultaneously, so you break into 4 subsets, you find that the performance for darker-skinned women is substantially worse than it is for sort of the best-performing subclass, maybe as much as 20 or 30% worse, which means that you've gone from finding 9 out of 10 faces in images that you find to finding only 2 out of 3 faces in the images that you present to these systems. And that's basically because the training data that was presented to these systems when the face identification system was built and calibrated did not have sufficiently many women in it and sufficiently many dark-skinned people in it for the people evaluating it to learn that they were going to miss these cases. I also want to talk a little bit about thresholds and the way that they impact performance. And so if we just go to the very end from the very beginning of the pipeline to the very end of the pipeline, I mentioned that we might look for the closest face print in the database once we have a extracted feature vector. And the way we might do that is we might pick a way to define the distance between 2 face prints. And then if that distance is smaller than a certain threshold, we will say that's a match. And I think that I have the, if you're looking carefully at the greater than less than signs on this slide, I think they are backwards. So if the distance is, if the score, so basically let's think of the distance instead as a score. So we're going to somehow turn that matching process into some level of confidence that it's a match, some kind of scoring system. If that score is better than some threshold, we're going to call that a match. In machine learning parlance, we would call that a positive result. And if the score is not is at or below the threshold, then that's a non-match, or what we would in machine learning parlance call a negative result. And so then we can think about what is the threshold we should use. And you can think about this a little bit like curving grades for a class. So if I give an exam in one of my classes and I try to decide, what score on the exam constitutes an A, the higher I set that score, the fewer A's I'm going to give out on the exam, but also the more of the people who get A's are high-scoring students who likely studied and learned the material. And then as I lower the score at which I give out an A, I'm giving out more A's, I'm getting more positive results, more matches. But maybe some of those matches start to be incorrect. They start to be students who didn't study, who didn't learn the material, and so I'm less happy. But I'm also less happy if I set the score too high, because it means that it's sort of too hard for people who do the work and do the studying to actually perform well in the class. And in particular, you should note that the place that I set this cutoff for an A, the place that I set the threshold, does not affect the performance of the system. I didn't make the exam any harder or easier. I didn't make the exam any better or worse at measuring how much material students have learned. I didn't make the face recognition system any better or worse at identifying faces. All I did was trade off the number of positives for the number of negatives, which means that I'm trading off the true positives, the real matches, and the false positives, the matches which came back but were not actually real matches. And something has happened to this slide. Anyway, I'll just move on. The only thing that I've really changed is my acceptance criteria, is the criteria by which I decide what is and isn't a match. And so I want to finish up by giving you some key takeaways. One is that none of these systems are perfect. All of them have errors, and so you shouldn't just take it to be the case that a face recognition system that you see that gives you an identification is actually identifying that person without some good evidence for that. And so Claire mentioned that the FBI feels that they're going to have to go through some sort of expert certification process. I should also mention that when we choose a method for turning those distances between face prints into a confidence score, that score is often reported as a percentage or a number between 0 and 1 or 0 and 100. And so it looks like it's a probability. It's the chance that the match is correct. It isn't. That number has no inherent meaning. It is just a number that is specific to the technology that's in use. And it would be wrong and irresponsible to compare those numbers across different systems or to consider numbers that are very high to actually represent high confidence that the system is working well. The next key takeaway is that face recognition is only going to work, any machine learning system is only going to work if the training data represent the data that you're actually using in the field. So you want to make sure that the training data represents the faces that you're actually trying to recognize. And then the performance of these systems can be quite variable based on things like pose and illumination and expression and the number of example photos you have of people. So, for example, if there's just one mugshot of someone in the background set, it might actually be quite difficult to identify them, or contrastively, it might make it easy to confuse them for someone else. Similarly, the resolution of the photos also matters, and on a CCTV camera, you don't get great resolution. And so I would say if you're trying to evaluate a face recognition system from a technical perspective, you'd want to ask if it has been evaluated for accuracy, how accurate it was found to be, and how that evaluation was performed. That is, was that evaluation performed on data that represent the population to which the system is being applied? And in a similar sense, to kind of focus on this bias issue, we really want to make sure that the systems that we build represent the faces that we apply them to at every stage of the pipeline. And so we want to make sure that we get that representative training data at every stage and that we understand what population we're applying the system to. And so since we're talking about evaluation, I'm going to pass it off to Kaitlin to talk a little bit about how to engage with face recognition in practice.
Hi, as Jumana said, I'm Kaitlin Jackson. I work at Bronx Defenders, and now that you've sort of gotten a bit of a primer on how this technology works and how the police are using it, I want to talk about what you do in court once you pick up one of these cases. But before we do that, one thing I want you all to keep in mind is that this riddle of how we successfully challenge facial recognition cases is something that nobody is exactly sure how to solve yet. So there are different challenges working their way up through courts now that are smart and interesting and that we hope will be successful, but we just don't know. So I hope while you guys are sitting here that you're all keeping your thinking caps on, because this is really a place where there is a lot of room to be creative and to come up with new, interesting solutions. So the first challenge you face in trying to contest a facial recognition case in court is recognizing that you have one in the first place. That may be much more difficult than you would imagine. As Clare explained, the way that facial recognition technology is being used right now, or should be being used, is that the police will zero in on a target, and then once they've done that, they will look for some other evidence. Once they have collected that other evidence, then they will arrest your client, and often when the charging documents or the arrest report or whatever it is that you get in your jurisdiction makes its way to you, it may only talk about that other evidence. You may have no idea that the reason your client was initially suspected was because of facial recognition. So what does that other evidence look like? It could look like a lot of different things, but in your most common scenario, it probably looks like an eyewitness identification. So what I believe is happening most of the time is that the police are zeroing in on a target, and then they are taking either that person or more likely the photo and doing some kind of identification procedure with an actual eyewitness. And then once you get that case in court, you may only see that there was an eyewitness identification. It's very likely that your case will look just like a standard eyewitness identification case. there is no real, bulletproof method to figure out that you have a facial recognition case, but there's a series of questions that I mentally go through to try to identify whether or not I have a case that's a strong candidate to think facial recognition might have been used. And the first thing I think about is whether identity is at issue. If identity is not at issue in your case, then you do not have a facial recognition case. The next thing you want to think about is, if this case were to go to trial, is the witness that the prosecution would put on the stand to identify your client and say that's the person, is that person a stranger to your client, or at least someone that is not well known to your client? Because if the ID witness is your client's brother, you do not have a facial recognition issue. It is incredibly unlikely facial recognition was used, and if it was, you still don't have a good challenge. The next thing I think about is whether there was some lag in time between the incident and the arrest. So, as Claire was saying, it does look like there may be some jurisdictions where facial recognition can be used quickly, but if your client was arrested on the scene, it's very unlikely you have a facial recognition issue. Right now, it still takes some amount of time, if for nothing else, just to pull the surveillance or to pull the photo or whatever the probe image is, and then most likely it's being sent back to the department, and there is some process that has to be done. So if your client was arrested immediately or on the scene, it's unlikely you have a facial recognition case. And the last thing I think about is whether or not there was a photo or video of the incident, or if I don't know, did it happen in a place where a photo or video makes sense, right? If your incident happened inside of your client's car and there was nobody who could have pulled out a cell phone camera, you probably don't have a facial recognition case. If all of those things are true, then I would suggest reaching out to the prosecutor and start asking about facial recognition right away. And start asking what the initial basis of suspicion was. It is entirely possible that you could have a facial recognition case even if all of those things are not true. It's just less likely. But anytime you've got a case where you cannot figure out why your client was suspected, I would suggest reaching out and asking the prosecution. Also, when you start having those conversations, one thing to keep in mind is that if the prosecution tells you, well, it's caught on surveillance or there was a positive ID, that is not the end of the conversation. I can't tell you how many times I've had a prosecutor say something like that to me, as if there's nowhere else to go. And while it's useful to know if your case was caught on surveillance, and it's useful to know if there is an ID, for this purpose, it really doesn't get to the heart of what you want to know. Because even if the entire incident was caught on surveillance, what you really want to know is who watched that surveillance and said, that's John Smith, right? Was it a person or was it a machine? And if a positive ID was made, that's also interesting, but what you want to know is, why was my client in a lineup or a photo array in the first place? So let's say you've done all that and you figured out you've got a facial recognition case. That is where the hard part really starts. And there's really two big barriers to challenging these cases in court that I see, and I think we have to understand them and accept them so that we can find smart ways to work around them. And the first barrier is that the police do not need probable cause to put someone in an ID procedure. I'm going to say that again because I think we know it, and it is something that's easy to forget. The police do not need probable cause to put someone in an ID procedure. The police are permitted to use all kinds of terrible techniques to put someone in an ID procedure. They could go to a psychic. They could use tarot cards, right? They could rely on their own gut feeling. None of that would be enough to make an arrest, but it's enough to put somebody in an identification procedure. And I think we all know that, right? Because when we're litigating identification procedures, we can litigate the composition. We can say those fillers shouldn't have been there. We can argue about what happens during an ID procedure, but there's not really a great avenue as a defense attorney to argue my client shouldn't have been in an ID procedure in the first place. Right? I should have. And the next reason that facial recognition is very difficult to challenge in court is that the law really is not designed well to challenge forensic practices that neither party is trying to introduce at trial. So typically when we're challenging a forensic practice, we're doing that at a Daubert or a Frye hearing, depending on which jurisdiction you're in. And what that generally looks like is that the prosecution would put an expert on the stand and we would cross-examine them and we would argue about whether or not it's essentially junk science, right? Whether or not they should be able to present evidence about this forensic technique. And if we're able to convince the court that this forensic practice isn't scientifically reliable, the remedy would be suppression of that forensic evidence, right? The prosecution wouldn't be able to put it in front of a jury. The difficulty with facial recognition is that right now, we're not seeing prosecutors trying to actually introduce this stuff in court, right? They're relying on that other evidence, often that identification that was made by an eyewitness after the facial recognition match happened. So if you write a Daubert or a Frye motion, it is entirely likely that the prosecutor will respond and say, we don't need a Daubert or Frye hearing. I am not going to introduce this at trial, and you're dead in the water. So those are the two barriers, right? So we really have got two jobs. First, what we've got to do is think of a smart way to pierce the identification. And here's what I mean by that. I think of a positive ID really as setting up a barrier. You can challenge what happens in court during the ID. You can challenge what happens after. It is really hard to break through that identification and legally challenge what happened before it, right? So we have to come up with a way to do that. And the next thing we have to do is we have to figure out what remedy we want. Because if there probably will not be, at least right now, and this looks like it may change over time, but right now there's probably not forensic evidence to suppress. So we have to think of something else to ask for. So what relief do we want? The first thing, and Claire had already mentioned this, is discovery. We should be asking for that in every case. In the materials that you all have, I have a motion that I had written that's got a discovery request, and Claire has got a model discovery handout that I'm sure is much better. We need that. We have a general understanding, like Josh talked about, of how this technology kind of works, but the truth is we don't know what algorithms the police are using. We don't know what the error rates are. As far as I'm aware, in any system, I don't think we have that yet in any jurisdiction. And in order for us to successfully argue that this stuff isn't reliable, we have to know exactly how it works. So you should be asking for discovery early and often, and if you get it, please, please share it, because we all want to know what that looks like. The second thing that we should be requesting in every case and making in every case are Brady demands, right? So we know that the way that this software works is that it throws up a handful of matches, right? It is not just zeroing in on one person. The machine might, depending on the software, maybe is throwing up 5 matches or 10 or 8, right? And then a human who is trained in facial recognition is the person who is actually actively selecting which of the photos they believe are the actual match. So if you imagine you had a regular ID case, right, and the eyewitness walked in and said, you know what, it is one of these 6 people. I am sure that it is. We would all consider that exculpatory information and demand and argue that we are entitled to know who are the 5 other people that it might have been, right? I think we can really think of this and frame it in the same way, using language of Brady and talking about that really as exculpatory evidence. And there also are going to be, I'm forgetting the word, scores associated with each photo, right? Of how likely how likely it is that the machine thinks it got it right. And in the same way, if you had an eyewitness that said, it's this person and I'm 70% sure that it's this person, we would also think of that as exculpatory evidence, right? Because that person is telling you, I'm not positive. There's a 30% chance I'm wrong. I think that is also something we need to be demanding, and we should be using really the language of Brady and thinking of that as exculpatory evidence early and often in all cases. Here is the trickier one, and this is really, I think this is the gold. I think this is what we really want, and it's the hardest thing to get to, is suppression of the eyewitness identification by the humans that are doing it post the facial recognition match. So there's two avenues I think that we can try to get there. The first thing we can do is incorporate challenges into the facial recognition hearing, or into the ID hearings that we're already doing, right? So in every jurisdiction, there is some sort of mechanism to challenge the suggestiveness of an identification procedure. And it looks different, but in different places, but we're all doing that in different ways. So sometimes we can make arguments that actually facial recognition, the use of it made the ID procedure more suggestive. So the only way we really can do that is if it was used in a way that the person making the ID knew about. Either they were told or it was obvious. And that happens, right? I firmly believe that the people who are the most suspicious of eyewitnesses are police, right? They've all had cases where they're sure they got the right person and the eyewitness picked wrong, right? Or in their opinion, picked wrong and a case fell apart. Police do sometimes do things that are really surprising to try to stack IDs. I have a case right now where we sent an investigator out to talk to an eyewitness in a case where facial recognition was used. And the eyewitness said, oh yeah, the police told me facial recognition had already made a match and asked me if it was right. I mean, that does happen. So I think that it is worth thinking about incorporating questions into the hearings you're already doing, asking the police what information they gave the eyewitness. If you are in a jurisdiction where you can actually get the eyewitness on the stand, asking that eyewitness about it. And if you've got the bandwidth and you can do it, if you know you've got a facial recognition case, send an investigator out and try to talk to that eyewitness. That may be really your best opportunity to get information about what they knew about the suspect before the ID. So that'll work sometimes, but it's going to be the rare case. I think the thing that what we really want to do is invent a new hearing with the relief we want and then request that, right? Every hearing that we do now was invented by somebody. And courts do have really wide discretion to make rulings about the admissibility of evidence. So that could, what would a novel hearing really look like? When you're thinking about it, you really have to frame your request with your remedy in mind, right? And I think that what we really want is something that looks like a Fry or a Daubert hearing where we can challenge the reliability of the technology. But the remedy we want is probably suppression of an identification, right? An identification by a human. So the way we would structure that argument, the argument I'm hoping will eventually work, is that we want the court to suppress the ID by the human because the facial recognition technology made the identification unreliable. You also have to decide and think about what standard you want the court to use. And I think that is part of the beauty of trying to think of it as a Fry type hearing, because there's already a lot of case law and already a standard set out that we can borrow. So if what we want to argue is that facial recognition makes an identification unreliable, then we have to think about how do we do that, right? It's kind of a tricky argument. And here's how I think we go about doing that. What really underlies most of the law that allows you to challenge identification is a burden on the court, a the court is required to try to limit the incident of misidentification. That is really the job. The undercurrent of identification law is not about fairness. It is about innocence, right? That is really what is going on. And most of the time, the way the court does that is by policing suggestiveness, right? Because we all agree if an identification is really suggestive, right, it's just more likely that the eyewitness might pick wrong. However, it is entirely possible, although not recognized by any court that I'm aware of yet, that you could have a forensic procedure that made an identification unreliable, even though it wasn't a suggestive ID procedure. And that's what I think we want to argue here, that in fact, the use of facial recognition is going to increase the incident of misidentification, right? And if we can make that argument, I think the court really should still suppress regardless of suggestibility. So why would that be true? I think of this as the look-alike problem. There is no reason to believe that eyewitnesses are any good at all distinguishing between strangers they saw briefly and someone who has been selected by a machine because they look just like that stranger, right? So if we can really make that argument, the real question becomes, how often does that issue lead to a misidentification? Well, the only way we can figure that out is if we get a hearing and we figure out if this technology works, right? And I think that's the argument we want to make to the court. How often is this machine getting it right, and how often is it throwing up someone who looks just like the person who did this, right? Because if the technology is getting it wrong frequently, then we would anticipate that we are getting a lot more misidentifications. You would assume that facial recognition in criminal cases is resulting in more positive IDs, right? But you would assume it's very likely it's resulting in more true positives and more false positives. And we need to figure out how often are those positives false positives. So that's the argument that I'm hoping will eventually work. I think that it is even a stronger argument in your cases for those of you in jurisdictions where single photo IDs are still done, right? So if it's a single photo ID, I think you can really make that argument even further, because at that point, is the human identification really new evidence, or is it just confirmation of what the machine has already determined? And I think that's how you want to think about and structure that argument. So a few thoughts about how you write your motion. First of all, I think you have got to try to explain this technology. When you start, you've got to have a section where you lay out for the court how this is working. They probably do not know. It is certainly true that people hear facial recognition, I think, and assume that it's like DNA, that it is more scientific, that it is more reliable. And you are unlikely to be successful in challenging this if you don't explain to a court how it's working in the first place. I also think you want to be really thoughtful about word choice. This stuff is brand new, and we as defense attorneys can frame how the court is thinking about it. I think you want to avoid the word match as much as you possibly can. I think you want to talk about candidates, right? Possible matches, but think about how you frame it, right? Because you do have the opportunity to frame it in a way that does not give the impression that it's reliable in a way that it is not. Also think you want to consider analogous forensic practices. That's tricky. I mean, this stuff really is unique, and in large part, it's unique because nobody's trying to bring it into court yet. But to the extent you can come up with forensic practices that, you think follow similar patterns, I think that's a very useful thing to do. And lastly, be creative. As long as you keep in mind the two sort of barriers to challenge we talked about before, and you're making sure that whatever you're arguing has a good workaround for those, right? That you're thoughtful about your remedy and that you recognize that you need to come up with a unique argument about why you get to challenge your client being in a lineup. There is so much room to think of brand new stuff. So I think I'll turn it back to Claire. That's really the end of mine. Oh.
So I think before I move to closing and where this technology is going in the future, I want to put a bit of a finer point on Brady, or connect it a little bit to how police use this technology and what does it look like in a given police unit, because I don't think I explained that well enough at the outset. So I'm going to give you 3 examples. Excuse me. The first is the NYPD. So what does the NYPD system look on the back end? An investigative officer has a photo, wants to identify who's in the photo. He sends that photo to the facial identification section. They edit the photo, the face gets rotated, normalized, edited. It's submitted to the face recognition algorithm, which, as Josh mentioned, is a bunch of different algorithms. They get 250 possible matches. Their candidate list is 250 people long. It is then up to an analyst to decide whether there is a possible match in those 250 people. What does that mean? The reason why they keep it that long is because they are not confident enough in the quality of the photos being input and the system itself to put the candidate, the correct match, in the top 5 or the top 10. They set it a default of 250 people to look through, which means from Brady perspective, your client might be number 175 on that list, which means the machine thought 174 people looked more like the person in the photo than your client did. Here's another example from Jacksonville, Florida. Jacksonville, Florida also has an analyst who runs all their searches for them. Investigating officer has a photo, submits it to this analyst. She's a civilian analyst, has had about 2 weeks of training on the system, doesn't know how face recognition works. She's acknowledged that in court. Their system gives an unknown number of candidates. In one case, it's 5 people. Instead of a confidence score, it gives a system of stars. She doesn't know whether it's 1 out of 1 stars or 1 out of 5 stars, but she does know that stars show up next to some photos. Those are the photos she sends back to the investigating officers. Let's talk about Ohio. Ohio, anybody with a login to the system can run these searches, which means that there is not training, there is not a certified, you don't have to be a certified face recognition expert, a forensic face expert, if you will, to run these searches and make a determination whether a possible match shows up in the candidate list. All this underscores the idea that this is not an established science. If the prosecution or an officer is trying to draw an analogy to the way AFIS works, there are so many more variables in a face recognition system than there are in AFIS. There is no such thing as a forensic face expert. No such thing. Doesn't exist. So, moving on, what does the future of face recognition look like? Where are we going? As I mentioned at the beginning, the FBI has stated that it wants to get to the point where it can introduce this as positive identification in court. But what else are we going to see? We are likely going to see in the near future the use of face recognition on body cams. You may already come across a case where the probe image, a static image, comes from body cam footage. What increasingly body cam companies are looking at doing, though, is incorporating artificial intelligence, including face recognition, in a real-time, live type system on the body cams. The idea would be that an officer could get an alert in his headset or on his mobile device saying, the person you just passed 20 seconds ago has an outstanding warrant for a violent, for an armed robbery. Why I'm flagging this, I think this is a particularly problematic application of the technology in that the person responsible for making a determination whether the machine got it right is an officer with a gun who has to decide in an instant whether he's faced with a public safety or public emergency situation. I think this places officers in an impossible position. I also think it places the public in a very dangerous position where an officer is going to, again, take an instant to decide whether or not he's going to draw his weapon on an individual. What if the system gets it wrong? We are increasingly going to see face recognition used in a surveillance capacity. China has a very widespread face surveillance system already. Russia also uses it to monitor protesters, to identify who is participating in anti-government protests. We like to think, oh, that's China, that's Russia. It's not going to happen in the United States. There are no laws against the use of face surveillance in the United States. Orlando has partnered with Amazon Recognition to test face surveillance, so real-time face recognition off of live cameras. So this is something that's already in testing phase in the United States today. And then I would be remiss if I didn't terrify everybody by ending on this note. There is a company that exists in the world called Faceception. They are an Israeli company, and they purport to have a contract with a Homeland Security agency somewhere in the world for not face recognition per se, but face classification. They claim to be able to use face recognition or face classification to determine whether somebody has a propensity to commit certain types of crimes, namely terrorism. If you look at their promotional materials, this is, I would argue, quite simply racism by algorithm. This is part of the technology. When companies are talking about what they offer to their clients, this is something that does exist in the world today. I'm confident that it's not being used in the United States, but again, there are no laws against its use in the United States in this capacity. So just something to be aware of. We talk about face recognition as this identifying an unknown individual. It also incorporates so many other possible uses that maybe revert us back to the days where we were measuring bumps on people's heads to determine whether they were productive citizens or potential criminals. So now we're turning it back to Jumana to take questions.
All right, thank you to our panel for that really informative presentation. Up on the screen, if you do have cases like this and you have questions, you want assistance, you want information, please contact us. Just a reminder, though, for questions for this webinar, email me at jmusa@nacdl.org, and we'll get your question asked. I'm going to take the prerogative, though, to ask my question first. One of the things I've been curious about, you talked about the different places that these images can come from. It can be a mugshot, it can be a driver's license photo, maybe something pulled off of social media, and on and on. If someone has, say, 3 or 5 different photos that are somewhere in this database, is there a way, or could there be a way, so I don't know if this is both sort of the technical and the legal aspect, to say how many pictures of this person are in your database and how many did it match to? Is there a way of knowing that? Is that, and it may be in the black box, but if there's 5 pictures of a person in a database, and it makes some percentage of match to one of them, but not the other 4, does that weigh in your favor for an argument? So is there a way to find that out and then use that going forward?
So I can answer that question in part, and then maybe turn it over to Kaitlin. So if we're looking at a mugshot database particularly, or even a driver's license database, the databases that the law enforcement agents are using to identify somebody, there will be duplicates in there. If I'm in a jurisdiction that asks me to re-up my driver's license database or driver's license photo every 5 years, it could be that I could be in that database a number of times. What we do see is when the searches are run, it is not uncommon for there to be the same person whose different mugshots show up multiple times. So that does happen, and they will be represented as separate entries in a candidate list.
And I think, my only response to that is a fantastic thing to put in your discovery requests. I mean, the truth is, until we get more responsive information about what the database looks like, we don't know, but it is a great thing to be asking for.
I just wanted to point out that I think it's a fantastic question It's also difficult because at least one of the photos in this problem setup is a photo for which we don't have a real true identification. So we don't know what the truth is, right? In a driver's license context, you probably have a pretty good association between a photo and a name. It could be the wrong name. Someone might have applied for a driver's license under the wrong name, or the agency might have gotten their paperwork mixed up. But if I have a photo from a surveillance camera, it has no name associated to it. And so you could ask, for each candidate, how big are the clusters, what other photos of those candidates existed and where did they fall in the match. But I think it's going to be a little bit difficult to interpret that kind of evidence from a technical perspective, although it's certainly very interesting and certainly very worth putting in a discovery request.
All right, well, I guess now that we're on the technical perspective, there's a question of, is it possible to fool or spoof facial recognition? Like, how unique are people's faces really, and is there data to that speaks to whether or not they're really super unique identifiers, or you could actually get one over?
So I don't know, and I spent some time looking for research on the question of how widely distributed are certain facial features, how much do we know about the distribution of faces in images, in social media, in surveillance footage, just among people in the world, and I don't think we know very much about that, which goes to Claire's point that there's no such thing as a forensic face expert, because that is just science that hasn't been done yet. In terms of fooling these systems, there is a technique that I didn't mention that works against a lot of image processing systems that people refer to as the problem of adversarial examples. And so the idea is that there might be the classification of one of these images or detection of an object may be very sensitive to one very small part of the image. And we can perturb the image in such a way that we cause the system to go wrong. But if you showed the perturbed image to a human, it's very clear that it's the same picture of the same thing. And this can even be, so sometimes people refer to these as one pixel hacks against image processing systems, where you change literally just one pixel in the image and it causes the classification to go wrong. This is maybe a bit more of a problem for object identification systems. So maybe you have a picture of a stop sign and you put a few yellow pixels, a yellow dot on the stop sign. There was a paper out of NYU where they were putting yellow stickers on stop signs, and then the stop signs were getting misclassified as cats and pineapples, and it makes you feel real confident about autonomous cars.
Yeah, and just a point on how unique are our faces. As Josh mentioned, there have been no population frequency tests to determine facial uniqueness, given how the algorithms measure uniqueness versus differences or similarities. No population frequency tests to determine, are we all unique as measured by these algorithms, or do we have doppelgangers out there? The NYPD system, they had some notable misidentifications when they first implemented the system, and most of them were twins. So we do look a lot alike certain people, and that can trip up algorithms. We talk about face recognition as this biometric, and there are two assumptions when we talk about biometrics. One is the uniqueness question, which hasn't been answered for face recognition. The other is stability across time, and as we know, our faces do change across time. And there have been studies that show face recognition performs particularly poorly on young people whose faces change pretty rapidly and who have quite literally fewer features than older people, and then also older people as well. So people maybe 65 and above whose faces again are changing rapidly. And in addition, the longer the distance, the time distance, the more time there is between when the two photos are taken that are being compared, the lower the accuracy is going to be because of the changes that quite literally happen to our faces.
Okay, so I have two more questions right now. So last chance, if you have a question, send it to jmusa@nacdl.org. So this may go to you, Claire, I'm assuming, but it's a question about if you're in a jurisdiction and it's not shown up in your case, you don't have the case to maybe ask the question yet, is there a way to find out, or how do you go about more generally trying to figure out what the police are using? How do you go about that?
Public records requests. This is something, so Jumana mentioned, my center put out a report in 2016 that did a survey. We FOIA'd over 100 agencies, and we're continuing to FOIA that, so it may be information that I actually have on file. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I would say public records requests. Also, just give them a call. It's a little hard to get to the right person to answer that question, but I found particularly with smaller agencies, they aren't necessarily trying to hide this information just because it's not public, just because it's not showing up, on their website or in your case publicly doesn't mean that they're intentionally hiding it. And it may be that you can get someone on the phone to tell you that their jurisdiction's using the tech.
Washington County, Oregon, the Sheriff's Department uses a product from Amazon called Recognition, and they actually worked with Amazon to write a marketing blog post about how they use Recognition. So that's just on the web. It describes in great detail with code examples how they use the system.
Yeah, do a Google search first.
Okay, last question. So at this point, in terms of the way the matches come back, would it be correct then to say there's a 30% chance of a mismatch, or that it's wrong if the algorithm says there's a 70% match? Or is there a misunderstanding of what the number represents?
So this is talking about confidence scores. Let's say, we get a candidate list back, and we're looking at and your client is a 70% chance. 70% has a 70% confidence level. What does that mean? As Josh mentioned, that means nothing. That means that the algorithm it either means the algorithm has matched about 70% of the identity points between the photo being submitted, or it's on a logarithmic scale, so it means who knows what. Generally speaking, it's the algorithm's own confidence in the similarity between the two images. It has no relationship to the probability that those people are the same versus those people are different.
I would go a little bit further and say that the scores mean nothing, and it would be irresponsible to assign them any meaning either as a chance of match or even at the level of saying that a score of 80 corresponds to twice the likelihood of a match than a score of 40. That is probably not even true. The numbers are very specific to the way the system was built and may even depend on things like the particular set of people who are enrolled in the system at any given time. The other problem with these numbers that I think is important to remember, there's a psychological phenomenon called automation bias that says that we as humans are more likely to believe facts that we get from a machine because we assume that someone designed the machine. It was supposed to work that way. The problem is that if you show an analyst a set of 250 matches and the true match is way down at the bottom of the list with a score of 30 out of a possible 100, and there are 174 people who have higher scores, it takes an analyst with a very strong will to say, I'm going to choose this person with a score of 30 over many other people who have scores in the 80s, 90s, out of 100, very high scores. And that, I think, is really a problem, and it's not a problem that's been studied. How well do these scores actually help analysts do their job? Do they confuse the analysts? It may be better that the analysts would perform better if the scores were suppressed. We just don't know.
And adding to that, depending on which system the law enforcement agency has purchased, these numbers are totally different. As I mentioned, Jacksonville's system is not numbers at all, it's stars. If the provider is NEC, which is one of the main algorithm providers, it's a logarithmic scale that will generally be a decimal, a 3-number decimal place representation. If it's Amazon recognition, it's a percentage match. So what the analysts are looking at is totally different depending on which system they've purchased.
And I would just jump in and say, all of that said, still request the confidence scores. Because while that is all true, right, we also know when an eyewitness says, I'm 70% sure, that doesn't mean that it is, there's a 70% chance they're getting it right. We really want this because it's still giving you information about the machine, the machine's confidence, and that's still something you want to litigate. It is still something you want to get, even if it would be irresponsible to make certain claims with those numbers.
Okay, we now have 2 more questions, and I think at that point we'll likely have to wrap. So the next question is about sort of where is the funding coming from? So which industries or institutions are pouring the most money and resources into facial recognition, R&D? Is it social media companies, military, law enforcement, private security firms? And so, what bearing does that have on learning more about what might be proprietary or classified research sources?
That's a very broad question. I like it. So when we talk about facial recognition, we're talking about a number of different uses. The one that we all probably are very familiar with, even if we don't know it, is Facebook. Tag suggestions, that's face recognition. So social media companies are very invested in this. If we look at the law enforcement space, a lot of the funding comes from the federal government. These used to be DOJ grants, and now they're mostly DHS grants that are given to the state and locals to purchase systems. These are systems they're purchasing from the commercial space. They're generally not building these systems in-house, so they will be purchasing from Amazon, for example, but more often a company you may not have heard of, a DataWorks Plus, a 3M Cogent, a Cognitech. So these companies are investing R&D into developing these systems, and then the money for the purchasing by law enforcement will come, generally speaking, from the federal government.
I guess the hard part of answering this question is that we don't really know how many R&D dollars in the private sector go specifically to this versus to something else, and if a face recognition company gets $10 million in VC funding, how much of that counts as R&D? I couldn't tell you. Maybe someone who looks closer at the books of that company could. But I would guess, irresponsibly speculate, that the private sector is the primary source of R&D funding here, social media companies. And the other thing that happens here is that we've moved from a regime where the state-of-the-art systems are built using databases of tens of thousands of photos with maybe hundreds of identities, and a few examples of each, to regular use of databases with millions of photos. An experiment coming out of Google, I read a paper yesterday that came out of Google a few years ago, and this was, 4 or 5 years ago. They were claiming that they used many millions of faces in their testing, 6 or 8 million faces. You hear about this all the time, and there just aren't any data sets that are available outside these companies of millions of faces. But realistically, you'd want a database of at least 1 million faces with, 10 examples each of 100,000 identities to do meaningful work on face recognition models that are performant at scale.
Okay, so now I have 2 more questions, and then this is really it. So, Joshua, we're going to stick with you. So as facial recognition programs continue to be improved, would it be a better route to develop them for a lower false positive rate as opposed to a higher true positive rate? Or is this simply 2 sides of the same coin? So will this tech conceivably improve or worsen over time?
I think that the tech will improve over time. I'd have to think a little bit about this question about types of error. I guess my generic answer to questions about types of error is what is the consequence of the error, and that's going to depend on how the system is used. So, if a system is used on a body camera to identify a single person and to say this is a person, we've got a name for them, we look them up in a warrant database, and we see that they have an outstanding warrant, and we feed that information to the officer. That's a very different kind of problem with many stages and possible failures at each stage than if we show an analyst a list of a large number of candidate matches and we ask them to post-select from that the one that's correct. It's a very different question to ask. Does this face recognition system get the right answer as its top, most likely, best considered candidate, or does this system find the right person in its top 5 matches, its top 10 matches, its top 20 matches? Obviously, as you move further down the list and you consider more possibilities, you're more likely to actually find the right answer. It's more likely that someone's face shows up in the top 20 matches from a system than in the top 1. So I think that speaks a little bit to how you would evaluate these systems. Although I think things will get better, but it's important to think about the context of use in terms of whether we think that better technology is useful. And then in the surveillance context, making the technology better may actually have negative consequences, right? If I walk by a surveillance camera and it's not very good at identifying me, then maybe that's not such a problem from a surveillance perspective. On the other hand, if the camera is really good at identifying people, especially people of color, right? Maybe the camera is good at identifying white people, but not so good at identifying people of color, and so it just misidentifies them on a regular basis, and therefore they kind of fall into an obscurity of mismatches. And so we're just surveilling people who are unlikely to be subordinated by the surveillance system. But by making the technology better, we suddenly take this group of people who have historically been marginalized, and we find a new way to surveil and marginalize them. And I think that's a risk that we have to consider.
Okay, last question. So for anyone on the panel, can you identify any cases of particular significance? So in other words, what cases should we be watching that directly or collaterally challenge these systems?
I mean, I think that's a question with a hard answer. I don't know of any. I mean, I've got a case I'm waiting for a decision on a motion I'm excited about. I'd imagine that there are more people with these cases, one, than realize it. I think probably a lot of people watching have facial recognition cases that they don't know are facial recognition cases. And I bet you there are people all over the country that do know it and are litigating it, and we don't know about it. But as far as I'm aware, I don't know that anyone has had a successful challenge on the trial court, in a trial court level. And I think before there's something huge to be watching, we're going to have to get a decision on the trial court that gets to a higher court before we've got something that we're all paying attention to. So I unfortunately, they may have other answers. I don't know of any.
No, that's right. I think the one case that has gotten the furthest that I'm aware of is the case out of Jacksonville, Florida. It's unfortunately not a positive case in that the defendant's name is Willie Allen Lynch. You'll be able to find a reporting on his case. He was convicted based on a face recognition match. He maintains his innocence, so it's on appeal. Basically, this case was where 2 undercover officers made a drug sale for about $50 worth of crack cocaine. They took a photo of the person who sold them drugs. Couldn't identify the guy. After about 3 weeks, they submitted it to their analyst, their face recognition analyst. She ran a search, got 5 possible matches. She sent the 1 starred photo back to the detectives, who took a look at just that photo and said, yeah, that's the guy that sold us drugs 3 weeks ago. They pick him up. He's arrested, tried, convicted, essentially on the basis of the detective's identification of him. But single photograph result of a face recognition match. The other 4 possible candidates were never disclosed to the defense. This case has gotten the furthest. In Florida, there are rules around depositions, so the defense was able to depose the analyst who ran the face recognition search. So there's the most transparency into the face recognition process in this case. As I said, it's on appeal now. We'll see what happens. They are challenging in part the face recognition component of the identification procedure.
I don't have a case, but I have an interesting hypothetical, which I think we haven't really gotten to. But one place that you see the deployment of these systems, especially in a sort of surveillance context, is in retail stores. So maybe a retail store would like to know, when a VIP customer comes in, or when a customer comes in who's likely to be problematic for some reason. Maybe they buy and return a lot of things, or hassle salespeople or something. You'd like to give the salespeople a heads up in either of these cases. So what that means is, for everyone who walks into the store or walks by the store, you might have a name. You might place a name of a person in a particular location at a particular time. And it's not that hard to imagine police in an investigative context going out and getting these lists of people and maybe saying, well, we can follow that name from this store to this bank to some other location of interest, and maybe more than that, we want to get the list of all the names in all of those three places and see who was in all three of those places and who followed along the path that a suspect went along. There was a similar case that used cell phone data to do this, called the High Country Bandits case. But I think that's another case that goes to what Kaitlin was talking about how hard it is to figure out when face recognition was used. It may not even be that the technology is in use by law enforcement. It may be in use by private actor who either gives or is compelled to give those identifications over to law enforcement, and maybe in a way that skirts whatever accountability is present in a law enforcement context. So I think that's worth thinking about.
All right, I want to thank our three panelists, Clare, Joshua, and Kaitlin, for sharing information with us about facial recognition technology. This will go up online at nacdl.org, and you can keep an eye out for future training.